Hi there, welcome to the last video in the series, right, video 5 for the gravity simulation using the C# job system series. This video we'll try to, there's two parts really. One part is to kind of document, and really this series of videos has been about documenting how to use the job system to make a gravity simulation. So it's the last class, which is the gravity controller. So the, about 9 minutes of video to document that. And then there's the actual process of making a new project in Unity and finding all the code on the Lokel Digital website, and then basically copying, creating your own project from scratch using that code. Essentially, you can get from the internet, that I've made available to you. Now, I figure some people will be interested in the sort of coverage, the overview of the Gravity Controller, minor behavior class, but maybe more people will be interested in how do I set this up from scratch, just taking the code and let me get this going. So what I'll do is I'll put timeframes in the description below so you can actually choose the thing you want to watch. Let's get on with it. So just to explain for a moment the position or the role of the Gravity Controller class in relation to everything else, the Gravity Controller class starts the simulation and maintains the simulation. So we've kind of touched on this before in the previous video. Basically, this is handling the integration with Unity, which also means start, maintaining frame by frame, and then when the simulation needs to end because the scene's gone away or because Unity's gone away, the program's ending. So it creates the Gravity system instance and manages it, and then basically tells it, new frame or update Gravity system. So that's basically its role. Now let's have a look at the code and move on from there. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the Gravity controller. Try to make it quick. First of all, if you haven't seen this before, the add component menu attribute is actually pretty cool because it makes it easy to control where in the Unity add component menu your component will appear. So basically here I've created in Unity, you'll notice when you add a component there will be different things like physics, etc. So here I can create my own kind of area called designer tech, and then under that Gravity controller will appear, and you can effectively change the name as well, so it doesn't have to be the name of the class in terms of how it appears in the menu. That can be useful, and certainly making your own area just makes it easier to find your stuff. So that's a trick. If you take nothing else from it, you might find this really useful. Okay, so obviously here we are setting up the fields that we need the editor to be able to manipulate. So for instance, here we have an array of prefabs which may or may not be populated. It's okay for the user to leave that empty. The number of instances per prefab, so it basically means that if you have 5 prefabs that you add in this array, if you want 3, then there'll be 15 overall instances created by this code. Otherwise, so it's a multiplier, basically. All right, so then we have the repulsion distance and the gravity strength, so they're passed straight through to the gravity system. Min pos and max pos, this is in each direction. It's really the minimum axis size. Okay, so in other words, in the X, Y, and Z directions, when it's creating prefabs, do you want it to be, how distant do you want everything to be, or do you want it to be squished together? So it lets you kind of control how dense your initial universe is. If you're dealing with gravity, sparse is probably better. Okay, so then we have a member variable for the gravity system. Then, okay, with start, what do we do? Well, if the prefabs are ready, then we create prefab instances. We'll see what this means, but basically you can bet it means that the array is populated with something. The collect all objects in the scene. So this will collect prefabs and any objects that already happen to exist in the scene. So you can set up your scene completely with objects that have the gravity behavior class, which we covered in the very first video. You could have that gravity behavior class added to all sorts of game objects and put them in the scene already. So you can design your scene that way in terms of the initial state. And then the GravityController will find them, including any prefabs that it adds, on top of that. And basically will create an array from that. And that will become the size of the system in terms of how big all the arrays are. That dimensions everything. So here we then need to make sure we've got some valid values. So for instance, with prefabs, the position in the gravity component structure may not be populated. So this makes sure they have the proper position as per the actual position in the scene. The other thing it does is make sure that mass is not 0, because we do divide by mass when we're calculating acceleration. Remember, force divided. So that's very important. The other reason why it's good to ensure the position is set up, if you have two objects in exactly the same position, which physically can't happen, like in the real physical world, when you have two objects coming together, their centers just don't collapse unless they become one object practically. So here what happens is if their position is 0, then you start having a distance of 0 and you divide by the distance and the maths blows up. And you'll see errors pop up in the Unity editor when that happens. So that's why it's important to make sure that all of the settings have the real positions. Okay. So then as long as all the objects that were found, if more than 0 of them, then we'll actually start the gravity system. Otherwise there's no point, and we'll give a little warning. I like to try to give warnings in my minor behavior code, so in case you don't set it up properly. Especially this would be useful in a team. The person who wrote the minor behavior may not be the person who's designing the scene. Nice to let people know what's going wrong. Update. This is pretty simple. We use this. Some people call this the Elvis operator, but basically we're checking to see if system is not null. If it is not null, then we call the update system with the current values of the repulsion, distance, and gravity strength. That means that once we hit play and we're using the editor, it is possible to change the repulsion, distance, and gravity strength values in the controller and see how that affects things. Right? So why this is done this way. On destroy, obviously figures out the fact that the controller, gravity is being brought to a halt. In other words, this scene is dying or the whole game is finishing, whatever. So therefore we need to dispose of the gravity system, which in turn takes care of all of the memory. Now, is prefabs ready? This basically checks to see if the gravity prefabs array is not null and if its length is greater than 0. So, pretty guessable. Right, so here, collect all the objects. This is pretty simple. With the game object class, there's a static method, find objects of type, so it just finds everything that has a gravity behavior attached to it, right? It has a gravity behavior. In the old Unity way of saying, would be called a component, but a minor behavior object attached to it, let's say. Okay, the ensure gravity components has valid initial values. Here we're basically getting the transform, that's to get the position, and we're getting the current settings value, which is gravity settings, being the gravity component on each object or prefab. We make sure mass is not 0, and we make sure that position reflects the position in the scene, and that's it. And then we update the entities, right, which is basically this array. And that's all that needs to do. Create prefab instances does this thing of basically for all of the number of, let's say, however big the prefabs array happens to be, it goes through and creates the appropriate number of prefabs for that. So in other words, if you have a prefab array with just one object in it as a prefab, so in the editor you just put one object in and you set the size to 1, then this will only loop once, and it will take that object out of the prefab array and it will then say create the number of prefabs. Create the number of prefabs is where we look at that number of instances that count per prefab type, and then which I said was like a multiplier. So there's two for loops going on. One is to go through each prefab type, and the other one is to then say, well, given that prefab type, let's go through the number of instances we're supposed to create for all of the prefabs. Remember, it's one multiplier. So if is that one multiplier value is applied to every prefab type. That's a bit of a, but anyway, I think you know what I mean. So then, basically here we instantiate it, give it a random position, try to make sure its mass is reasonable. Yes, that's a bit of an overkill, but anyway, and then we're done. And then here, this is where the random position is calculated using that min pos, max pos. Like I said, that name's probably not exactly right. It should be min axis value, max axis value or something. Probably be a better name. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the class. Now, really, the values in here are all kind of reasonable values. What might you want to play with? 100 might be a bit much. You might want to make that 10. You may want to make this more sparse than just 50 and 50. You can try 1,000, something like this. And that's in each direction. So that's from 0 to the max, from 0 to the negative max, right? So that's, yeah. Okay, so anyway, that's how the code works. So we'll go from a fresh project, we'll set it up, we'll copy the code, get it going. These noisy messages, these always come up. Okay, so the first thing we'll do in the package manager is just add the first compiler. Now in project, first there. Installing this will also install Unity Mathematics. That done. Let's now set up. Back. So the first one will be called the code. So what we'll do now is we'll switch to here and we'll start from the first video, go to the end. I'm going to create a Gravity component here. Create C# script Gravity component. Open this up. Okay. Here, this is everything we want. One. Back over here, the other one is the gravity behavior, which makes the gravity component available from a, well, can be added to a game object. So that behavior. Nice. Code. So yes, I'm just copying and pasting and blatting over the template you get. The first one, videos, video 2, code, the one job, the Gravity 4. That, and force job. Yeah. go. And that's why we need the burst compiler here. So the next one here, sim acceleration, velocity, position. Me and my massive job name. Yeah. Yes. Here and just remember, these have all been explained in the previous video in terms of how they work and what. Okay, so here. Video 4. Oops. Oh, no, come here. Let's go. There. No. Okay, and then the final one, GravityController, which is this video. Getting impatient doing it through Unity. We'll do it here. The difference is here. I've got to put the yes. Okay, code. Okay. To Unity, it will compile all that. Doesn't already. That's pretty much. All right. There's a few things we need to do to make use of it all. It would be good to make a materials folder, and it would be useful to have a prefab. Okay, in the materials folder, because this doesn't look a lot like space, it'd be great to make a new skybox. Material. Be funny about it. Space box. All right. Go. We want cathedral, and basically we dial everything. There you go. Boring when you think about it. There we go. No. New. Ah, there you go, atmosphere thickness. Good. Done. Okay. So now in here, let's make an empty, and this will be our gravity controller. Now in here, go add component, designer tech. This is where we have basically the gravity settings is really the gravity behavior, and the gravity controller as well. Yeah. So this is where we have the settings for our simulation. And now we can make prefabs or some objects to bring in here. Some materials will help. So let's make a material for a couple of planets. So let's call this one green planet. And oddly enough, we'll make it green. This probably shouldn't be smooth. Certainly shouldn't be very metallic. Plenty of things we could play with here. GPU instancing is good. That's okay, yeah. Now those things would actually cost a bit in terms of rendering and how many objects you want to have. You might tweak these sorts of things. We'll make a blue. Planet. Realm. Turn on GPU instancing. The other thing we might make is so that's not much in the way of albedo. It will be emission. Yeah. Make it some sort of bright orangey thing. Good to name that. Okay, so now we'll make here. Call this the sun. Oops. Sun. We'll make it. Now, let's get rid of the collider. Don't need it. And instead we will collapse that. We can, it doesn't really matter where it goes. Scale, let's scale it up. Up by 5, something big. We need to add the gravity settings to it. Now we can tell it to be big. Let's be 500 kilograms. You probably should be tens of thousands, something, but anyway, start with that. And let's create other planets, and then later on we can use these as prefabs. So this one can be, will be our blue planet, blue water planet. This do it. Okay, and let's get rid of the collider, close things down, and then we'll add. I mean, you can leave it on if you really want, but it won't help at all. Add the gravity settings and give it a mass of 3. It'd be a very big planet. We can make there be a green planet. Call this the planet. That's really got a great name. I'm not feeling very original. Green planet will do just fine. Again, we get rid of the collider. We add gravity settings. Save the scene. There we go. Okay, so one basically flying off in the distance, and the sun is moving. The gravity is basically working. So let's now use prefabs. So in the prefab here, we'll basically just take these two, drop them into the prefab folder. Yeah, that didn't work so good. Hold on. Another time maybe? Yeah. Okay. Now I can leave them there. It doesn't really matter. Go back to the GravityController. Let's go to the prefabs. We make the size 2. Now we can drop these into the tab here. Now obviously I could create new planets. Delete those there now. And we do 3 instances per prefab type. It's going to give us 6 overall because it's 3 times 2. Now I can make them 30. I could make it whatever number I want there. Save this and hit play and just see a few more objects. Now they'll be randomly located and we can see, yep, all kinds of orbits. Now things are really dynamic because this is set to 100. N is a bit more realistic. And save, hit play. Find it's a little less violent, but still fun. Yeah. The other thing is we can actually change some of these values on the fly. So gravity strength we can change in the repulsion distance. So I can make this like 2. Probably a bit late. Things are kind of zipped off into the distance because they've been repelled. Like that 2 and make the repulsion distance 0.01 or something. You've got to get really close before they repel. Now things will be a little bit slow. Yep. Now what we might do, just for making life a bit interesting, is we'll attach the camera to the sun. And up a bit. Kind of. Where's the camera looking that way? Get out this way. That way, no matter what happens to the sun, because it gets forces applied to it, no matter what happens to the sun, we'll see the action. Yeah, because the sun being the biggest thing in town, everything will come to it. Now it sort of takes a little while. Look at the FPS, it's outrageously high. There we go. So we know the sun's been moved, but the camera's following it now, so we always get to see what's going around. Now, if we make enough objects, what we'll see is controller, make this 300, well, make it 200, whatever. So there should be 400 in total. We can disperse things a bit more by changing these values, but let's just have a look. Okay, that's a bit more intense. Look at that. Now they're kind of going towards each other and to the sun and whatever else. In fact, they're probably a bit more interested in each other. Because the sun only slightly outweighs all the rest of them. Now they're starting to settle down. That's a nice little orbit going on there. It's pretty static. So there we are. There you can see it's pretty easy to take this code and set it up and get your own gravity simulation going. There we are. Hopefully you were able to understand how that gravity controller fits into the scheme of things, and that you're able to download or copy the code and set it up in your own project and have some great fun with it. So at this point, you know how the game works. Thumbs if it was working for you, and subs if you would like to see more. Thanks for watching.